All right, guys, so now that all of these walls are finally painted, I can start getting my tool set up, which is amazing, and also start getting the dust collection set up. And it's kind of important to do both of these at the same time, because if you guys have ever used these kind of larger woodworking machines, you'll know that they pretty much barely work without dust collection. So obviously the first step in setting up a dust collection system is to get the dust collector installed. And let's rewind to when the Perkins Builder Brothers guys were here installing this drop ceiling, and I can show you how I got my dust collector mounted. So this dust collector, which is a Clearview EF5, is a behemoth, and I definitely needed some extra sets of hands just to get it out of the spray room where I've been storing it. And then once I had it out of there, I could take some measurements and figure out the height of the wall mounting bracket, which is what this whole dust collector hangs on. Once I figured out the height of the bracket, I could get it mounted on the wall, and I had a little pro tip for helping to not lose hardware when you're moving from shop to shop. The pro tip, whenever you move, if you got hardware, I take a Ziploc bag, throw the hardware in it, wrap it around the item, and tape it to it. Can't lose it.
Nice.
All right, I think that's strong enough. Once the bracket was installed, we could set the dust collector on top, which was definitely a team effort. And unfortunately, I think in all of the hurry to get it mounted, I forgot to start one of my cameras. So I only had this kind of weird time-lapse camera angle, and then we dropped in the bolts to get it secured in place. With the dust collector in place, we could finally get the wall built to close up this kind of dust collection closet. And the whole point of this closet, in case you guys haven't seen it up till this point in the series, is to hopefully reduce the sound of this dust collector. It is extremely loud. At my old shop, I had it exposed. It was only a few feet from my table saw, and it was honestly pretty deafening. So Eric and I framed up that front wall. And since I'm trying to keep this build budget friendly, I got a little creative with the framing material.
What's going on right here?
Well, you see, we're on a budget here. So I employed the Board Stretcher 3000.
I didn't think there was such thing as a board stretcher.
You know, non-structural load member.
Okay, we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
Hopefully it won't just shatter when I toe screw through it.
Yeah.
All right, it worked.
It worked, man.
Okay,
Beauty.
that's it.
After getting the wall framed, we could go ahead and install a door and the opening we had framed out. And this door we used was actually left over here at the shop in the attic space, and it worked out perfect. It's a very beefy, solid core door, definitely good at blocking sound. And we used this PVC jamb that was also left over, which has a bunch of weather stripping, which also really helps with sound control. That being said, this PVC jamb was a little bit tricky because it was so bendy, and it took a lot of adjustment to get this door working well, but after a lot of tweaking, we finally got it working smoothly. So then fast forward to present time, I got some spray foam added in the gap between the framing and the door jamb, and again, for sound reduction, air sealing is one of the most important parts of the equation. Next, I could start getting the ductwork installed, and this took quite a bit of trial and error since I was basically reworking the entire ductwork layout from my old shop. And you guys might remember that I kind of splurged on all of this Nordfab ductwork, and I definitely wanted to be able to make good use of it. And I eventually got it figured out. The first Y here will go to the table saw, the second Y goes to the jointer and bandsaw, and then finally it ends with a drop for the planer and drum sander. And I moved my tools into place as I got the ductwork hung up so that they weren't in my way, and my planer and drum sander were next on the list. I temporarily hung the ductwork with this pipe hanger strapping, but ended up swapping that out later on, and I'll talk about that a little later. Once that was done, I needed to get my table saw reassembled since I had to take it apart to move it out of my old shop so that I could figure out the exact location of the drop for the table saw. And I did take this opportunity to get a new extension table for the saw since I'm not going to be installing the router table insert again since I never used that on the table saw at the old shop. And I also went ahead and replaced the ruler since it had gotten pretty worn down over the years of use. There we go, much better. Once the table saw was put back together, I got the table saw drop figured out, and I ended up putting it at the back right corner of the saw because I really don't want any hoses going across the floor in this shop like I had at my old shop, because I'm hoping to make a lot better use of carts since this is a much bigger space, and obviously hoses just get in your way. Next, I worked on the ductwork for the jointer and bandsaw, and I was able to actually angle one of these fittings off of the 45 to get me a little bit more headroom in this area. While I'm working, let's talk about the sponsor of this week's video, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is the world's largest therapy service, and best of all, it's 100% online. With BetterHelp, you can tap into a network of over 30,000 licensed and experienced therapists who can help you with a wide range of issues. To get started, you just answer a few questions about your needs and preferences in therapy. That way, BetterHelp can match you with the right therapist from their network. Then you can talk to your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether that's through text, chat, phone, or video call. You can message your therapist at any time, and you can also schedule live sessions whenever it's convenient for you. If your therapist isn't the right fit for any reason, you can switch to a new therapist at no additional charge. With BetterHelp, you get the professionalism you expect from in-office therapy, but with a therapist who's custom picked for you, along with more scheduling flexibility and at a more affordable price. To get 10% off your first month with BetterHelp, visit betterhelp.com/craftedworkshop. That's better, H-E-L-P. Thanks again to BetterHelp for sponsoring this week's video, and let's get back to work. Unfortunately, I ran out of ductwork and fittings before I got all the way to the bandsaw, so I had to go ahead and place another order for some more Nordfab, and while I waited on that to ship, I went ahead and reconfigured the planer drop. These metal blast gates just slip right into the Nordfab, and to make sure the blast gates are well sealed to the Nordfab, I went ahead and added a bead of Lexel to seal it. To hold the blast gate in place while the Lexel dried, I added 2 self-tapping screws, and I also added another bead of Lexel over those screws just to make sure those holes weren't going to leak as well. And I also used some alcohol to help tool the Lexel, and this is a great tip when you're working with any kind of sealant like this. The alcohol will basically provide a barrier between your hand and the sealant itself, and it'll allow you to spread out the sealant without getting it all over you. Next, I can move back over here to the closet to get the dust collector wired, and this particular dust collector uses a contactor, and in case you don't know, a contactor allows you to control a 240 volt piece of equipment, a high voltage tool like this, with 120 volt equipment like this IVAC switch. So the dust collector plugs into the contactor, the 120 volt side of the contactor plugs into the IVAC automated switch, and that switch is then able to control the dust collector being turned on and off. With the wiring done, I could go ahead and get the filter stack installed next, and I wanted to go ahead and add this new Clearview filter shaker that they've just come out with. Unfortunately, I had to cut the silicone between the 2 filters, which was super difficult, and my camera actually died while I was doing this, but I had to get out a reciprocating saw to finally pry these 2 things apart. But eventually I got it done, and then I could install the brackets for the shaker assembly itself in between the 2 filters. And the idea with this filter shaker is that you can put it on a timed switch or a smart switch or something like that, and it will literally just vibrate these filters and hopefully knock off some of that fine dust. And that fine dust building up on these filters is really what negatively impacts your airflow. So obviously you want to clean off that fine dust, and having something automated like this just kind of makes that whole process a lot simpler. Went ahead and tested it out, and it removed a ton of that fine dust in just a few minutes. And I'll go ahead and set this up on a smart switch to probably run a couple of hours each night, and that way these filters should stay nice and clean. I also went ahead and installed this new clean out box from Clearview, and this will just make it a lot easier to see when that fine dust has built up enough to where I need to vacuum it out, and it has a nice, easily accessible port to vacuum out that dust, unlike the previous setup that I had. And I also sealed between the 2 filters where the filter shaker bracket installed with more Lexel. Before permanently installing the filter stack in the closet, I went ahead and added a dolly to the 55-gallon drum that I used to collect the dust, and that'll just make it a lot simpler to empty. And I found this on Amazon, and it seems to work really well. Makes moving around the drum super simple. All right, so I think everything is wired up and attached. I've got 1 opening in all the ductwork, because if I had all of the blast gates closed, all of that suction would cause some issues with the ducts. And now I can just flip the switch and it should fire right up. Usually helps if the circuit breaker's on. Seems like that should be good. It is pretty tight in here, so I have a feeling that getting this drum out to empty it is going to be a little bit annoying. Probably should have built this whole thing a little bigger, but not much I can do about that now. Not bad at all. I guess now I can go ahead and start getting the mineral wool insulation added up in this kind of open framing, get that all covered up, and then we can really see how big of a difference this is going to make sound-wise. I added those little support strips, which will just help keep the insulation in place, and then added the insulation itself, which again I was able to bring over from the old shop, so it was nice to be able to reuse that. And I just made sure to seal up any gaps because again, air movement is the enemy when it comes to sound transmission. Next, just like on the rest of this closet and on the CNC room, I added a layer of drywall, which will be under the final layer of plywood. And this was kind of a pain to fit around the ductwork, but I eventually got it installed, and then I could add that layer of plywood. And I know what you're probably thinking, this plywood looks pretty janky, and it definitely does. I was basically just using up a bunch of the scrap pieces from when we installed this plywood on the ceiling above the garage doors. But once all of the trim is on, you won't see any of this. And I figured rather than sending some of these pieces to the landfill, I would be able to reuse them on this closet. Next, I got the trim installed, and I also finished up the drop ceiling in this area where we had left it open so that I could finish up this wall. And then once all of that was done, I added some spray foam around the duct opening, as well as some big stretch caulk around all of the trim. And finally, once all that was done, I could test out how much this reduced the sound from the dust collector. So I don't have a professional decibel meter or anything like that. I just have a little app on my phone. So I'll go ahead and turn the dust collector on, get a reading with the door open, and then close the door and get another reading, and we can see what the difference was. All right, so it looks like the dust collector noise was peaking right around 90 decibels, which again, that is super, super loud. According to this app, about 30 minutes of exposure to that level of noise will start to temporarily damage your hearing. But with the closet door closed, I was hovering right around 76 or 77 decibels. So that's a reduction of 13 to 14 decibels. And that might not sound like a lot, but you got to remember that the decibel rating scale is logarithmic, meaning that a 10 decibel increase is actually 100 times louder. So reducing this by 14 decibels, I'd say is a big win. I can basically run this dust collector without hearing protection and not sustain any hearing damage, which is awesome. Not that I'll ever do that. I always have hearing protection in while I'm doing woodworking, but it'll just be nice not to have that extremely loud roar all the time in the background while I'm working in here. So as you guys saw earlier in the video, I was using this metal pipe strapping, and I used that at my previous shop and it worked well, but this roll that I was using was actually left here by the previous owner, and this stuff is just a lot thinner, and I actually had one of these break, which was kind of crazy. I was looking around for some other options. I was watching my buddy Matt Cremona's video on his recent dust collection system install, and he used these really cool little things called gripples. Really simple to use. You basically just feed the wire through this little hole here, and then you feed it through the other hole, and it creates this awesome adjustable little loop. So I can tighten this up if I need to. So I'll have one of these at the ceiling, which will mount to the ceiling with one of these little, I guess, kind of tie downs. I think this is for a boat. Basically, I can screw this to the ceiling to a joist, have a nice secure connection there, and then do another loop at the bottom, and I can loop that around the ductwork itself. It'll be really adjustable, very nice looking, very tidy, and incredibly, incredibly strong. I don't have to worry about this stuff breaking. I'm gonna go back and swap out all of the spots where I had this pipe strapping, and then I'll continue on and wrap up the rest of the ductwork over to the bandsaw, since I have the new parts on hand now. So all of the ductwork is officially in now that this drop for the bandsaw is done. These were the last couple of parts I was waiting on, and I was able to reuse a lot of this setup from the last shop. For this bandsaw, since it has two 4-inch ports, I have a 6-inch to two 4-inch Y here, and I have one of these Rockler Dust Right connectors on one of them, and that's great for just being able to kind of clean off any extra sawdust that might build up on the table. But one thing I do need to do here is swap out the plug on this bandsaw. In case you guys don't know, it's really easy. You basically just cut off the old plug, which is always a little bit weird. Then I can strip back this insulation. And so as you can see, I've got my two hots, the black and the white, and then the green, which is my grounding conductor. So this particular plug can work in a few different types of configurations. So I'll need to take this whole thing apart. Whoops. Which is what I need to do anyway to feed the wires in. Got to be joking. Come on, man. So now I can go ahead and attach the wires to the blades here in the plug. But the one thing I always seem to forget, that I'm not going to forget this time, is to put on this little rubber strain relief. And I have wired these things so many times forgetting to put this on, and then you got to take the whole thing apart. So, total pain. There we go. And now we can plug it in. All right, so as you guys saw, I was struggling to get the bandsaw to turn on. As it turned out, there was a bad breaker, so I had to swap that out. The outlet was only getting 83 volts, obviously not enough to power this machine. And now that that's fixed, I can show you guys how this whole kind of automated system works, because I realize I haven't really gone over that. So there's a few different components to the system. The first component is this tool sensor. This clamps onto the tool's cord, and it will detect any voltage that's running through the cord when you turn the machine on. This sensor does need to be plugged in. That's one of the only kind of annoying things about this system is when you're setting it up, you need a lot of extra plugs, so just be aware of that. But basically, once it senses current, it will light up a little red LED to indicate that it's sensing current, and then it will send a signal to the associated blast gate, which you program in with some little dip switches. Super simple. So the blast gate will open, and then the sensor will send a signal to the switch, which is connected to the dust collector, to turn on the dust collector. Because obviously you want the blast gate to open prior to the dust collector turning on. So in my case, the switch will keep the dust collector on for a minimum of 10 minutes, and that's just to keep it from wearing down the startup capacitors in the motor. With a larger motor like that, if you were to cycle the motor on and off and on and off over and over again, it would wear it out. This switch has a minimum runtime feature built in, which is really nice. But if you turn off your power tool after that 10 minutes has elapsed, the tool sensor will sense that there's no more current going through the cord. It will then tell the dust collector to turn off, and then it will close the blast gate, again, kind of reverse order of the initial startup. And so basically, you don't have to even think about dust collection. You walk up to the tool, you turn it on, everything happens automatically, and then you just work. It's a really killer system. It's a little bit expensive. They have a few versions of these blast gates. They do have some less expensive plastic versions of the 4-inch gates in case, you're more of a hobbyist. But if you make woodworking projects for a living, I can't even imagine how much time this would save you, not to mention the health factor of having good quality dust collection and never having an excuse not to turn it on because you're in a rush. I think an essential system, and I would never have a dust collection set up without it. All right, guys, I am super happy with how the shop is coming together. Next up is going to be setting up my miter saw station and building a workbench top for that lift top table I have. So if you guys don't want to miss those, go ahead and get subscribed and ring the notification bell. Also, I'll have links to all the tools and materials I used in this video in the video description below. And last, if you want to support me, I sell merch. I have plans available for a lot of my woodworking projects, and I have both Patreon and YouTube members set up. All right, thanks for watching, y'all, and until next week, happy building.